I saw my wife sneak out to a party at the neighbor's house, so I showed up and went to her, in the middle of the crowded living room, where she was dancing as if she were free of any commitments. When she saw me, she froze. She just said, "I can explain." But I had already understood everything. Without a fuss, I simply turned my back and left our story at the end. In the following days, she tried to contact me, but her lover made it clear he didn't want anything serious. Alone, she faced the emptiness of her own choices. I moved on, and time brought me a new love, someone who looks at me truthfully and builds alongside me with loyalty. When she met me again, her eyes begged for a chance, but her heart was already elsewhere. I forgave her, yes, but not to return. And that's when her penny dropped. It wasn't the kissing scene. Nor the body pressed too close. Nor the wide smile of someone who had completely forgotten the world she had promised to share with me. What destroyed me there, standing in the bright room, was the lightness with which she moved, as if she had never loved me, as if I were just a shadow she had left behind long ago. As she twirled, danced, and laughed, something inside me collapsed silently. It was the end, I knew. But more than the end, it was the truth. The truth we pretend not to see until it becomes impossible to ignore, that someone can be with you every day, but have been gone for months. That an "I love you" can become a habit, a routine, a lie. That even touch can be a disguise for absence. I lived through it all. And when I saw her there, dancing with her eyes closed, I felt that woman was no longer mine. And maybe she never had been. She froze when she saw me. Not out of fear. But because, deep down, she never thought I would show up. She thought she was smart, discreet, invisible. But love has a scent that no lie hides. Love feels. And I felt it. Even when everything seemed normal, even when the kiss came before coffee and the "good nights" still sounded sweet, I felt something was off. The silence between us was no longer peaceful. It was discomfort. It was emptiness. I tried to believe it was a phase. That time would bring back what we had. But time brings nothing. It only reveals. And what it showed me that night was that, however loyal, patient, and present I had been, she had chosen another path. There was no scandal. I didn't scream. I didn't cry there. I didn't demand explanations. I just stared at her like someone seeing for the first time. And I saw what I never wanted to see. That the commitment was mine alone. That the love was mine. That the care, the sacrifice, and the effort were all within me. And that on the other side, there was only escape. A desire for freedom that didn't combine with an alliance. An urge to experience something new, even if it was superficial. And so, in the middle of that room, surrounded by people who didn't even know my name, I understood everything. I turned around and left, leaving behind not only a woman, but the illusion that we had a future. In the days that followed, she tried to explain herself. She called me, showed up at the gate, and wrote messages that began with, "It's not what you think," and ended with, "It was a mistake." But mistakes have consequences. And betrayals, especially emotional ones, can't be undone with apologies. Her lover didn't want commitment. She quickly realized she traded stability for instability, depth for appearances. And for the first time, she was alone. But the worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was knowing that the only place she wanted to be was the one she herself had destroyed. While she sank into regret, I followed. And not out of revenge. Not out of pride. But because pain taught me to choose myself. I found someone who doesn't carry doubt in their eyes. Who doesn't mince words. Who isn't around only when things are easy. This person didn't fulfill me because I was missing something. She added to someone who had finally learned to be self-sufficient. And when, months later, I met her again, the woman who was once my wife, she seemed smaller. Not physically. But emotionally. Her eyes begged for a second chance, but her heart was already elsewhere. I forgave her, yes. But not to go back. I forgave to move on unburdened. And it was in that moment that she understood, she had lost. Not just any man, but someone who truly loved her. She tried to hide the emptiness. She tried to smile. She tried to make jokes. But eyes don't know how to lie. And hers screamed for something that no longer existed. The days passed. Longing became her friend. The memories, once sweet, now stabbed. She tried to distract herself with other loves, other stories. But no hug felt right. No conversation felt deep. No care felt soulful. And that's when the weight finally hit her, she had lost a true love. And exchanged it for a shallow fling. And now, all she had was the memory of what she had destroyed. She began to mentally revisit every moment we had. Our lazy Sundays, the simple dinners with background music, the fights followed by reconciliation, the plans for the future. It all passed like a movie. A movie she now watched alone. She tried to resume some routines. She went to the park where we used to walk together. She sat on the bench where we used to talk. But absence was a ghost that wouldn't let go of her hand. That world, which had once been home, became a memory. And the memories, once sweet, became bittersweet. Because she knew, it would never be that way again with anyone else. She began talking to the mirror. Searching for answers. Wondering when she began to stop loving. And she realized it wasn't all at once. It was little by little. It was when she stopped asking how my day was. When she began hiding her cell phone. When she preferred the silence of the television to the sound of my voice. When she allowed the other person in, even though she knew there was still someone there who loved her. Love doesn't die with a scream. It dies in neglect. In distraction. In absence. And when she realized this, it was too late. And what came next was even crueler. Because the world moved on. People moved on. And I, especially, moved on. Not angrily. Not in a rush. But with clarity. And that hurt her more than any indifference. She wanted me to suffer. To look back. But I didn't. Because the pain she caused was so deep that it forced me to grow. And growth doesn't allow for returns. Only progress. And while I built a new love, sincere and light, she collected regrets. She tried to find in other arms what, deep down, she knew she'd lost forever. She tried to get back together. She tried to have conversations. She approached mutual acquaintances. One day, she even wrote, "Do you still think about me?" I read it. But I didn't reply. Because when we understand our own worth, we stop begging for scraps. And she saw it. She saw that my gaze was different. That my smile was genuine. And that I was happy. Truly happy. With someone who, unlike her, knew the value of faithful love. And that's when the penny dropped. It wasn't anger or frustration anymore. It was the weight of conscience. Of the wrong choice. Of regret that comes too late. She still tried to convince herself that she deserved a second chance. But time is a cruel judge. It doesn't go back. It simply shows, in no uncertain terms, that some doors, once closed, never open again. And she slammed hers shut herself. Today, she's constantly trying to fill herself with what's left. But the remains don't warm her. And the echoes of what we were remain there, whispering everything we could have been, but which she chose to let die. And there's one detail, perhaps the cruelest of all, that she only discovered too late. A simple yet devastating detail. Something she never imagined, and that, when it came to light, changed everything. But that part, will only be revealed at the right time. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize betrayal, never. All stories are fictional, but based on real situations that show how one wrong choice can destroy everything: loves, lives, futures. Our goal is clear: show that cheating is not worth it. Get ready to listen now. A shocking story, intense and unforgettable. Good story. And may this lesson be remembered. Lucas met Helena on an ordinary afternoon, one of those that seem insignificant at first glance but, over time, reveal themselves to be the starting point of everything. He was leaving the coffee shop where he usually stopped after work, and she hurried in, clutching a folder of documents and mumbling something about a missed deadline. Their eyes met by chance, but there was something there, an invisible pause in time, a kind of silent recognition between two strangers. It wasn't love at first sight, but there was curiosity, a welcome restlessness, that feeling that something was about to happen. Helena was a lawyer, focused, practical, and passionate about the idea of justice. Lucas, a civil engineer, was methodical, observant, a calm-spoken man who preferred to listen rather than talk. She had an energy that permeated rooms, he, a serenity that anchored those around them. They were opposites, but their complementarity soon revealed itself. The beginning was light, almost silent. Small encounters, messages exchanged midday, coffees stolen between appointments. Love blossomed there, unhurried, layered. Helena felt safe with Lucas in a way she had never experienced before. She was used to turbulent, intense relationships, full of ups and downs. With him, it was different. There were no games. There was presence. And that, for her, was revolutionary. Lucas, in turn, saw in Helena a breath of life, an intensity that took him off autopilot. He liked the way she spoke with her hands, the way she discussed ideas passionately, the way she seemed determined to transform everything she touched. Being with her made him feel more alive, more whole. They decided to move in together after 2 years of dating. It wasn't an impulsive decision. They talked, considered, and adjusted their agendas and expectations. The house they chose was simple but cozy. A corner townhouse with large windows and a small balcony where they liked to sip wine on weekends. Helena insisted on painting one of the living room walls a deep blue, saying it brought depth to the space. Lucas laughed but relented. And little by little, every corner of that home began to bear their mark. The plant he watered every morning, the books she stacked beside the bed, the paintings they'd chosen together at an art fair. The routine developed naturally. There was no excess. There was sharing. They had rituals. On Sundays, they made pancakes. On Wednesdays, they watched old movies. On rainy nights, Helena insisted on dancing in the living room, and Lucas, even awkwardly, joined her because he saw an almost childlike joy in her eyes. They fought sometimes, of course. Over small things, like the volume of the TV or the way the toothpaste was squeezed. But reconciliations came quickly, with long hugs and apologies that didn't need to be forced. The foundation was solid. Respect was non-negotiable. Or at least, that's how it seemed. Their circle of friends was small but loyal. Neighbors knew them by name and often commented on how well-matched they seemed, complicit partners. Helena smiled when she heard this, and Lucas just nodded, shy but proud. Their families also got along well. Her parents appreciated his discretion, and his admired her independence. On holidays, they shared visits, traveled, took photos on empty roads, and collected small moments that, together, formed something precious. When they were apart, they missed each other. Messages, audio messages, small gestures, it was a love fueled by daily life, but still carrying the flame of discovery. But, like any relationship that surpasses the enchantment phase, deeper layers emerged. Work began to take its toll. Helena became involved in more complex cases, and the days grew longer. Lucas also faced pressure at the construction site, tight deadlines, and increasing demands. They both began coming home more tired, more silent. Conversations diminished. Not for lack of love, but for exhaustion. The intimacy remained, but it took on a different tone. There were no longer so many nights spent dancing in the living room. There was silence. Not a hostile silence, but a silence that signaled a lack of time, or worse, of intention. The routine, once light, began to weigh on them. Even so, there was still affection. Helena still made him coffee in the morning. Lucas still left notes when he left early. But something was changing, slowly, like a crack that starts invisible and spreads over time. Small disagreements began to emerge, a cancelled dinner, a forgotten birthday, a postponed promise. Helena became increasingly introspective, often returning from work silently, head down, expression distant. Lucas, unsure how to help, withdrew. He began spending more time reading, tinkering with old projects, trying to keep himself busy so as not to overthink. Neither of them knew exactly how to name what was happening. But they both felt it. Communication was no longer as fluid. Helena started sleeping later, often claiming she needed to finish something at the office. Lucas slept earlier, but always stared at the empty side of the bed with a weight on his chest. The emotional distance, though subtle, was already visible to anyone who knew how to observe. Still, he believed. He believed in what they had built, in the solid foundation, in the story they had both so carefully crafted. He trusted her. And he trusted the love he felt. That's why, even in the face of absences, silences, and mood swings, he held on. He chose to stay. He chose to believe it was just a phase. That everything would pass. From the outside, everything seemed fine. The Instagram photos continued to be full of smiles. The couple's get-togethers with friends continued as normal. Anniversaries were celebrated with dinners and gifts. But a shadow was growing. Invisible to others, but increasingly real between them. Helena was becoming more impatient. Any question from Lucas felt like a demand. Any gesture of affection was met with a forced smile. He noticed, but didn't question it. He was afraid of the answer. Afraid that whatever was forming between them was no longer enough. Still, he didn't give up. He planned trips, suggested different activities, tried to revive what had once been light and spontaneous. But often, he received rejections disguised as weariness. Deep down, Lucas felt like he was being left behind. But he tried to convince himself it was just a moment. He believed in love as a commitment, not a passing feeling. And so, he continued. Because for him, love wasn't just about feeling good. It was about caring, even when the other person walked away. It was about waiting, even without guarantees. It was about being there, even when everything seemed to be going wrong. He wasn't a man of grand gestures. But he was constant. Faithful. Present. And he thought that was enough. On the other side, Helena was experiencing a restlessness that even she couldn't quite explain. She felt trapped between what she had built and what she wanted, between security and risk, between routine and impulse. She began searching for something that even she couldn't quite grasp. Sometimes she would look at Lucas and feel grateful. Other times, she would look at him and feel a void. As if something had gotten lost along the way and she couldn't quite place it. She tried to convince herself it was just fatigue, just work pressure, just a phase. But the truth was deeper. And dangerous. The house remained the same. The blue walls were still there. The plants were still watered. But the atmosphere had changed. The feeling of home gave way to an absent presence, an intimacy that grew cold. And the days, once so shared, now ran parallel. Two bodies under the same roof. Two lives walking side by side, yet without touching. Their story didn't begin with empty promises. It was built with care and dedication. But even the strongest castle can crumble when the foundation begins to silently erode. And there, amidst the established routines and weakened affections, something was already crumbling. They just didn't know it yet. But time would tell. And when the truth came out, no memory, no matter how beautiful, would be able to contain the damage. The weeks piled up like poorly organized boxes in an emotional warehouse, and Helena seemed increasingly distant, even though she slept just inches from Lucas. He noticed the details with the precision of someone in love, the unusual perfume she'd started wearing, the excessive time she spent on her phone, smiling at the screen, the late-night messages she'd say were office stuff. Her eyes, once so lively when she met him at the door, now wandered. She spoke less and less, responding in monosyllables and becoming irritated by simple questions. When he suggested dinners, short trips, or even a walk in the park, he received evasive answers and the same old excuse, tiredness. Lucas wasn't an insecure man, never had been, but Helena's coldness was so palpable that he began to doubt even his own certainties. There were no shouts. No arguments. Just a silent withdrawal, as if she'd left inside and left her body there, filling the space. On weekends, she would invent meetings, get-togethers with friends, trips to cafes that somehow never included him. Lucas noticed her delays, her sudden mood swings, her haste in leaving, and the visible relief on her face when he didn't ask questions. Sometimes he'd try to reach out to her with a gesture, a touch on the shoulder, a kiss on the neck, but she'd dodge him with the same mechanical kindness of someone who no longer belonged to that touch. And he, faced with this, tried to convince himself that everything would pass, that she'd return to being that vibrant woman who made him dance in the living room even on the most difficult days. He began to pay even more attention to the little details. He started washing the dishes before she saw, buying flowers, leaving notes with phrases she liked, and one night he even prepared dinner with her favorite dish, playing the music they used to listen to. Helena arrived late, came in talking on the phone, ate dinner in silence, and went to sleep with a kiss on her forehead that lasted no more than a second. He sat at the table, staring at the remains of his dinner, trying to find a reason to still believe. She even changed the way she dressed. Clothes she hadn't worn in ages reappeared, elaborate makeup on ordinary days, new lingerie folded neatly in the closet. And instead of celebrating, Lucas felt his stomach churn. An uncomfortable intuition took hold, the same one that hits us when we know something is wrong, even without proof. One Saturday morning, seeing Helena's reflection in the mirror as she put on makeup for another get-together with friends, Lucas considered asking her directly. He thought about telling her he was seeing everything, that he felt her absence every day, even with her physical presence. But he kept quiet. The fear of the answer, the fear that the suspicion would become reality, overcame his courage. Then he smiled, told her she looked beautiful, and watched her leave, as he had so many times before, wearing a perfume that wasn't his. In their neighborhood, there were always small gatherings between neighbors. A barbecue here, a birthday party there, a few good glasses of wine. It was through one of these unpretentious invitations that the evening unfolded. A couple across the street was throwing a party, just for the closest people. Lucas didn't want to go, he didn't like forced crowds, and said he'd rather stay home. Helena, upon hearing the host's name, hesitated for a second, too quickly for him to catch, but then she covered it up and said she might stop by. On the night of the event, she donned a black dress she hadn't worn in ages, applied perfect makeup, spritzed on a new perfume, and left without looking back. Lucas stood on the porch, watching the quiet street and the few cars passing by, a glass in his hand and an anguish in his chest that refused to subside. Inside, there was a growing unease, a need to confront what he pretended not to see. An hour passed, then two. And something inside him tightened. His mind tried to rationalize, she'd just left, she was meeting with the neighbors, everything normal. But his heart knew. It knew the way it knows who it loves and knows the steps of the person it chose. He took the key and crossed the street with calm steps, as if carrying their last hope in their pocket. As he approached the house, music could already be heard from the gate. Laughter, conversation, familiar voices. He entered with the naturalness of someone invited, and greeted 2 or 3 familiar faces. No one noticed his presence. He walked through the house with attentive eyes, observing every corner, until he saw her. She danced in the center of the room, surrounded by people, with a lightness she hadn't shown in months. She was free, alive, smiling with all her heart, as if the world were weightless, as if she were free. And beside her, a man. Tall, expressive, his hands firm on her waist, his eyes connecting with hers in a silent, intimate code. It was more than friendship. More than sympathy. It was connection. Lucas stopped at the door to the room, without an immediate reaction. Her heart raced, not out of anger, but in confirmation. She saw him. And for an instant, time seemed to stand still. Her smile faded, her eyes widened, her footsteps stopped. The man beside her hadn't yet noticed her. But she had. And in that moment, the universe split in two, the before and the after. Helena slowly moved away from her dance partner, her face pale, walking toward Lucas, visibly shaken. She tried to smile. She tried to appear natural. But guilt was a veil impossible to hide. Lucas said nothing. His eyes, until then calm, now held a depth that blended sadness, disappointment, and a silence that screamed louder than any words. Helena tried to speak, began some random sentence, "I can explain," but her voice came out shaky, fragile, irrelevant to what was already before his eyes. There was no scandal. There was no need for an audience. Just a truth that, finally, became undeniable. Lucas took a step back, looked away, and with a simple gesture, turned his back. He left not only the crowded room behind, but a part of himself that still believed in us. As he walked back home, the street seemed longer. The wind, colder. The house that had once been a refuge now waited for him empty. He entered, calmly locked the door, sat on the sofa, and ran his fingers over the cushion that still held her scent. But he didn't cry. He was numb. The pain would come later, in waves. For now, it was the shock. The clarity. The confirmation of what his body had felt for a long time, but his heart refused to accept. The next morning, there were no arguments. Only silence. Helena tried to speak. But Lucas, with a direct look, told him he no longer needed explanations. That everything had already been said in the gesture. That there was no room for apologies where trust had been killed with a stranger's hug. In the days that followed, Helena tried to return to her old self. She sent messages, left notes, made coffee. But Lucas no longer reacted. His presence was physical, but emotionally, he was already gone. And she, seeing the abyss forming, began to understand that what had once been safe was now lost territory. She tried to convince herself it had been a slip-up, a confusion of feelings, a momentary lapse. But deep down, she knew, you don't just betray a body, you betray a story. And their story, however beautiful, was now marked by a point of no return. She didn't yet understand the magnitude of the loss. She thought that with time, with persistence, she could win him back. I still didn't understand that Lucas wasn't the kind of man to make a scene. He was the kind of man who, when he leaves, takes everything he's built with him, and never comes back. But what she also didn't know was that what would come next, what hadn't yet been revealed, carried an even greater pain. A secret. Something that would completely change the way she viewed everything that had happened. Something that, if discovered, would make her regret hurt with an intensity she hadn't even imagined possible. Time had passed with a cruel slowness, as if each day had twice as many hours. Helena now walked through the rooms of the house with light steps, as if afraid of disturbing the emptiness. The silence seemed to mock her, occupying the spaces that once belonged to laughter, to complicit conversations, to touches that spoke louder than words. Lucas no longer lived there. She took few things with her when she left, but what remained was the most painful, his absence. The absence of his smell on Sunday mornings, of his slippers discarded in the corner of the living room, of the dirty coffee cups left on the counter. None of that would return. She still tried to fill the space with routine, but there was no routine without him. No routine, no meaning. In the early days, she had denied the extent of it to herself. She thought he needed time, that he would return, that all she had to do was give him space. But time only increased the distance, and Lucas showed no sign of returning. He was irrevocably far away. That's when she decided to look for him. She texted, called, stopped by his mother's house. Every time she tried, she encountered the same wall, silence. Until one day, he answered. His voice was calm, yet distant. Helena almost didn't recognize him. She asked to talk. Begged, really. And he, with a deep sigh, agreed. They said they'd meet at a cafe, but she asked him to come to her house. Their house. The one that was no longer theirs, but still held too many stories. Lucas arrived late in the afternoon, with the serene expression of someone who'd already said goodbye inside. Helena waited in the kitchen, and when she saw him enter, something stirred inside her. He was different. Not in his appearance. But in his gaze. There was a firmness she didn't remember seeing before. She tried to smile, but shame prevented her. She lowered her eyes and said, in a restrained tone, that she didn't know where to begin. Lucas replied that she should just say what she felt, because she already knew the facts. She didn't need to explain what had happened. He just wanted to understand why. She began slowly, saying she hadn't planned it, that she felt confused, pressured, that everything between them seemed to have cooled. She said she didn't want to hurt him, that she didn't know how it had gotten out of control. Lucas listened to her with the demeanor of someone who no longer expected anything. He wasn't looking for excuses. What had happened was already irreversible. What had brought him there was something else. A necessary final point. Helena, realizing he wasn't reacting, moved closer, her eyes welling, saying she missed him, that things could be different, that she was willing to rebuild. She was, finally, willing to learn again. Lucas then looked at her with an expression of restrained pain and said he didn't doubt her regret, but there was something she needed to know. Something that, until that moment, he had chosen to keep hidden. Helena frowned in confusion. She felt a sudden chill run down her spine. Lucas hesitated, took a deep breath, and spoke with the same calm he used to announce simple things. He said that in the last months before the separation, when things began to go wrong, when she was pulling away more each day, he searched for a way to keep himself together. He said he didn't pursue anyone, didn't seek distractions, but he began to get closer to an old friend, someone from the past, with whom he exchanged few messages. There was nothing there but respect, but she listened to him. And at a time when he felt invisible in his own home, that listening saved his sanity. Helena interrupted him with a short, almost blunt question. She wanted to know if he had been involved with this woman. Lucas denied it. He said he respected the relationship until the very last second, until the moment he saw with his own eyes that it was over. Helena seemed relieved, but the relief was short-lived. Lucas then revealed what he had still been keeping hidden. He said that, one afternoon, he had undergone routine tests and received unexpected news. At the time, he was tired and stressed, and thought it was just fatigue. But the tests showed he had faced a blockage that prevented him from having children naturally. It was a definitive diagnosis. The shock made him rethink many things. He considered telling her, but put it off. He was insecure, afraid it would change the way Helena saw him. He was afraid she would start to look at him with pity, or worse, with frustration. She stood still. She'd never imagined he was going through something like this. She'd never noticed the signs. Or maybe she'd been too busy with her own emptiness to notice his. Lucas then continued. He said that, despite this diagnosis, he'd decided to move on with his life. That he was ready to adopt, or live in other ways, with or without children. He wanted Helena by his side. He wanted to build, even without certainty. And then, his voice broke for the first time. He confessed that, the week he saw her at the party, on that particular night, he'd bought 2 tickets. He'd planned a trip for the 2 of them, where he'd tell her everything, open his heart, and together they'd think about the future. He wanted to show her that, despite the hardships, love could still be the center of everything. But what he found at that party was the opposite. It was abandonment. Helena put her hand over her mouth, and tears began to fall. She tried to speak, but couldn't. Her watery eyes said what her voice couldn't. Lucas watched her with calm pain. There was no anger there. Only mourning. A love that had died before it could even be rescued. He said the reason he'd kept that secret was simple: he didn't want her to stay out of pity. He wanted to be chosen, even in his flaws. Even in his limitations. Even when the road seemed harder. And now, with everything that had happened, there was no point in hiding it anymore. Because I no longer expected anything from her. Helena knelt beside him, begging for forgiveness, saying that if she had known, everything would have been different. But he just looked at her and said that those who truly love don't need any more reasons to stay. That those who choose to betray, even without knowing everything, have already decided to leave before their time. Her pain now had a different nature. It wasn't just guilt. It was the discovery that, while she was searching outside for something she didn't even know what it was, he was preparing a gesture of love. While she betrayed him, he was choosing her. While she distanced herself, he was planning a way to start over. And she had destroyed all of that without knowing it. And now she knew. And there was no going back. Helena remained there, kneeling on the kitchen floor, surrounded by memories. Lucas stood, stroked her face tenderly, and said he forgave her, but he couldn't go back. Because sometimes, forgiveness has nothing to do with returning. It has to do with liberation. And that he had already freed himself. Then he walked out the door. Leaving behind a broken woman, a story that could have been endless, and a love that, despite everything, was real. But which she only recognized when it was too late. And there, in the silence that fell after his departure, she began to understand, for the first time, what she had truly lost. And this understanding would stay with her for the rest of her life. Helena couldn't move for long minutes after Lucas walked through that door for the last time. The sound of the latch clicking into place, so subtle and definitive, echoed like thunder in her ears. Still kneeling, her face wet with tears and her breath ragged, she stared at the floor, trying to find any shred of emotional ground to support her. But all that remained was darkness. For the first time, she understood what it meant to lose someone in life. His absence wasn't just physical, it was complete, irreversible. There was no hope left, and it was a silent poison coursing through her veins. She spent that entire night sitting on the living room sofa, with no lights on, no television, no cell phone. She didn't want distraction. She wanted to feel. She needed to feel everything she had avoided for so long. Because now there was no escape. The following days were filled with what remained: the clothes he hadn't taken, the books on the shelf, his favorite cup on the top shelf, the scent that still lingered on her pillow. Helena walked through the rooms as if visiting ruins. In every corner, there was a small vestige of a love she'd demolished with her own hands. She tried to work, tried to stick to her routine, but Lucas's face wouldn't leave her mind. His revelation had exposed a pain deeper than any punishment she imagined she deserved. She thought about the time he'd spent planning that trip, the weight he'd carried inside without ever burdening her, the way he'd chosen to love her even in the face of a limitation that, for many, would be the end of a dream. And she, instead of loving him more for it, turned her face away and sought distraction in the arms of someone else. This was the naked truth, unfiltered, unapologetic. She'd traded love for vanity, profundity for distraction, truth for fantasy. One morning, after another sleepless night, she decided to seek out the man she'd gotten involved with. She needed to understand what it really meant, needed to know what was left of it. She arranged to meet at a secluded cafe, where no one knew her, and waited. He arrived late, as usual. He smiled with an empty charm, as if nothing had happened, as if they were just two adults playing a casual game. When she began to talk about everything that had happened, he interrupted with banal phrases, trying to make light of the situation. He said he'd never promised anything, that everything had always been clear between them, that she was exaggerating. Helena stared at him with a lump in her throat. For the first time, she saw clearly what that man really was, an escape. A mirror that reflected only the shallowest and most selfish part of her. She felt ashamed. Not only of him, but of herself. She got up from the table without finishing her coffee and left without looking back. It was there that she understood the true meaning of loneliness. It wasn't being without company, it was realizing that the only company she had in decisive moments was her own absence. Over the weeks, he tried to start over. He went to therapy, started writing letters he would never send, started going to the park where they used to walk, sat on the bench where they talked about the future. But everything hurt. And it was meant to hurt. Because she needed to feel every last drop of the consequences of her choices. One day, on a cloudy afternoon, she decided to visit the old bookstore where Lucas loved to waste time browsing. He wanted to reconnect with something still pure. Upon entering, he saw a woman sitting at one of the reading tables, laughing softly with a man she knew very well. Lucas. Time stood still for a second. He was different. Lighter. More present. His gaze shone in a way she no longer remembered. The woman beside him was discreet, but there was a connection between them that needed no fanfare. It was simple. It was natural. It was love. Helena left with a broken heart, but with a strange relief. It was as if she had finally understood that Lucas was no longer part of her story. That the love that had once been theirs now bloomed in another garden. One she would never have access to. She considered leaving the city, starting over somewhere else. But she understood there was no point in running away. She had to face it. She had to continue living in the places where she had been happy and where she had destroyed that happiness. It was the least she could do. There was no longer any room for blame. All that was left was to learn. And learn the hard way, with definitive loss. A year passed. The seasons changed, the house took on new hues. Helena renovated her room, changed the furniture, and started over from the outside in an attempt to reorganize the inside. One ordinary morning, when she had no longer expected anything, she received an envelope with no return address. Inside, a letter in handwriting she knew well. It was from Lucas. It wasn't an attempt at rapprochement. It was a farewell. Not a spiteful farewell, but a gentle closing. He said he was fine, that he had found peace and that he wished she would find it too. He thanked her for the good times, for the lessons learned, and said he forgave everything. But he asked her to forgive herself, too, because love cannot survive where hatred resides, neither toward others nor toward herself. The letter ended with a phrase that would resonate with her for many years: some people come to teach you what love is, others come to teach you what happens when we lose it. Helena put the letter in the top drawer of her desk and closed it carefully. That night, she lit a candle, sat on the porch, and cried. She cried shamelessly, without reservation. Not because she still loved him, she knew that love was already hidden somewhere untouchable. But because she finally understood that everything she destroyed was born of a choice. That the betrayal wasn't a momentary mistake, but a continued neglect of something that should have been protected with both hands. She realized that not all love gives a second chance. That sometimes, forgiveness comes only so the other person can move on in peace. And that, in life, some loves are only experienced once. And once lost, there's no going back. All that's left is to move on. More aware. More humble. And, above all, more alone. Lucas's letter arrived like a cool breeze on a hot day. There was no warning, no hint that he would write again. The envelope rested in the mailbox like an unexpected ghost, silent and yet impossible to ignore. Helena held the paper with trembling hands, almost reluctant to open it, as if its contents might somehow alter the little balance she had painstakingly built over the course of that year. But it was impossible to ignore. In that moment, she realized that some stories don't end with a scream, nor with absence, they end with the bitter delicacy of a handwritten period. And this period wasn't just about the end of a relationship, it was about the end of an illusion. That she could still, somehow, undo the past. And perhaps the most painful thing was realizing that forgiveness had come. But with no return. No door ajar. No second chance. It was a forgiveness that freed him. And left her with the weight of understanding. In the days that followed, Helena found herself facing a profound moral dilemma. She had always believed she could make amends for what she had done, that love could endure even betrayal. But now, with everything said, with the letter kept as a trophy of regret, she began to question the limits of forgiveness. Does love, no matter how true, really have to endure everything? Does someone who betrays, even in pain, have the right to ask for a new beginning? Or are there mistakes that, due to their gravity, simply end the right to ask for anything? The pain of loss was no longer the focus. What hurt now was the bitter learning that some actions are definitive. That there are wounds that, even healed, leave scars too deep to ignore. In contrast, Lucas was living a completely different moment. Since that last conversation in the old house they once called home, he hadn't looked back. Not out of coldness, but out of wisdom. He understood that insisting on trying to save what had died would be disrespectful to his own history. And even though he had cried all there was to cry, even though he had carried the weight of silence for a long time, the fact is that he had found peace. And more than that, he had found someone who saw him with clear eyes, without guilt, without a past. A woman who arrived without promises, but with gestures. Who didn't ask for proof, didn't demand presence, but offered reciprocity. Someone who, little by little, filled spaces not with noise, but with constancy. Who understood the depth of silence and who knew that, sometimes, loving is just being. Lucas learned from her that true love doesn't have to be intense all the time, it has to be real. And he allowed himself to experience this without guilt. Because he knew that loving again didn't mean forgetting. It meant respecting what happened, but choosing to move forward. Helena, for her part, found herself surrounded by memories that no longer knew where to turn. There were photos she could no longer look at, songs she avoided listening to, perfumes she changed so as not to trigger memories. Everything was an emotional minefield. She began writing about her pain, not to expose it, but to understand. She developed the habit of sitting on the porch every morning with a blank notebook and scribbling down random words. Sometimes she wrote letters to Lucas that would never be sent. Other times she wrote to herself, trying to understand the exact moment she lost herself in him. It was in this process of silent writing that she began to see herself more clearly. For the first time, not as a victim of the situation, but as an agent. She no longer sought redemption. She sought meaning. One random afternoon, she received an unexpected invitation. A mutual friend invited her to a dinner with acquaintances. He said Lucas would be there too. Her heart raced immediately, not out of hope, but out of nervousness. She hadn't seen him since that day at the bookstore. Part of her wanted to go, part wanted to disappear. She considered refusing, but something inside told her it might be important. Not to get back together, but to face it. And so, on Saturday night, she dressed simply, tied her hair up casually, put on some light lipstick, and left the house with uncertain steps. When she arrived, the atmosphere was calm, the music low, voices soft. And he was there. In the corner, laughing at something someone was saying. He was different, and yet so familiar. When their eyes met, there was no shock. There was a respectful silence. A serene recognition of someone who had once been everything to each other and was now just someone who had passed by. They spoke briefly over dinner. Polite questions, restrained answers. He told her he was about to move to another city for a new project. She simply nodded, with a small smile. At the end of the night, before leaving, Helena approached him. She said she was happy for him, that she truly hoped he would find everything he was looking for. Lucas, with a firm look in his eyes, said he hoped the same. That she, too, deserved to find peace. There were no hugs, no touching. Just a meaningful silence. And then he left, once again. But this time, there was no pain. There was acceptance. In the following months, Helena made important decisions. She moved house, sold her old furniture, donated clothes, and started over in a practical way. She began visiting her parents more often, reconnected with old friends, started running in the park again, and began teaching professional ethics at a local college. What had once been a burden became a learning experience. And in one of her classes, while discussing decisions and consequences, she realized that remembering them no longer hurt. It simply provoked reflection. She wouldn't regret it any less, but she also wouldn't let regret define who she was. She learned that betrayal destroys much more than relationships, it destroys the image we have of ourselves. And rebuilding it takes courage. Meanwhile, Lucas was beginning a new phase elsewhere. The new house was smaller, but full of light. With his new partner, he cultivated a relationship based on transparency. There were no secrets, no accumulated silences. And even when difficulties arose, there was dialogue. He now understood that emotional maturity is more important than any vow of love. And with her, he learned that it's not passion that sustains a bond, it's a commitment to truth. He used to walk around the neighborhood, stop at simple coffee shops, and laugh more easily. Sometimes he thought about the past, but without burden. Only with gratitude for the lessons. He knew that, as much as it had hurt, that story was necessary for him to become who he was now. And for that reason, he didn't carry resentment. Only memory. The moral dilemma Helena faced was no longer about winning Lucas back. It was about becoming someone who would never betray him again. Not out of fear of loss, but out of conscience. She understood that by betraying someone who loved her, she was cruel not only to him, but to the version of herself that believed in love. And to truly forgive herself, she needed to commit to a new ethic. No longer based on promises, but on actions. And that doesn't happen overnight. It's a daily process. It's slow. But it's possible. Life, then, went on. Different. More mature. And both knew they would never forget what they had experienced. Not because they wanted to keep the pain alive. But because they understood that true healing isn't about erasing, it's about remembering without bleeding. And it was in this conscious remembrance that each found their new version. Distant. But free. Each, finally, with what they deserved. Winter arrived early that year. The leaves began to fall earlier than expected, covering the sidewalks with a silent yellow, as if even nature was trying to tell her it was time to let some things go. Helena now lived in a smaller apartment, with large windows that let in both the cold and the light. Her previous home was a thing of the past, not out of cowardice, but out of necessity. The space was the same, the objects were still there, but the air had become unbearable. Closets held too many memories, and even the sound of her footsteps echoed memories that no longer made sense. In her new place, she calmly reconstructed habits, like someone putting together a puzzle after accepting that the previous image has been lost forever. And there were good days. Days when she woke up wanting to go out, to talk, to teach, to exist with ease. But there were others when the shadow returned and sat with her at the table like an old friend refusing to leave. The difference is that now she knew how to face this presence, without denying it, without running away, just accepting that this was also living, dealing with what remains when everything that mattered is no longer there. One particularly cold morning, Helena received an unexpected call. It was Sophia, Lucas's sister. The two had grown very close during their relationship, and even after their separation, there was a mutual affection that endured despite the inevitable separation. Sophia spoke gently, saying she knew it might not be the right time, but that she was organizing a small gathering for her father's birthday and that, for some reason she couldn't explain, she felt Helena should be there. There was silence on the other end of the line, and Helena, after hesitating, simply replied that she would think about it. Throughout the day, the idea stuck in her mind. It was as if something inside her knew that the invitation wasn't just a social gesture. It was a milestone. A crossing. And deep down, she knew that refusing would mean continuing to hide. Accepting, on the other hand, would mean facing not only Lucas, but herself, in a more mature, more definitive way. 2 days later, she sent Sophia a short message, "I'll be there. Thank you." The meeting was scheduled at a farmhouse outside the city, in a secluded and simple setting, with tall trees, wooden benches, and a small room with a blazing fireplace. The atmosphere was welcoming, almost nostalgic. Helena arrived earlier than planned, and this forced her to cope with her own anxiety in the first few minutes. People arrived gradually, familiar faces emerging like vivid memories, hugs that mixed affection and surprise. When Lucas arrived, accompanied by his girlfriend, there was a brief internal turmoil. Not among the others, but within her. Watching them together was an exercise in emotional humility. There was no exaggeration between them, no showy affection. But there was truth. And that, as difficult as it was to face, was beautiful to see. Lucas, upon seeing her, approached her respectfully. He gently touched her arm, and they exchanged a serene, mature look. His new companion, with a calm smile, also greeted her elegantly. There was no tension. There was peace. And that peace hurt a little, but it also healed. Later, as people spread out into the outdoor area, Helena sat near the fireplace, patiently watching the fire dance. Lucas approached and, with a subtle gesture, asked if he could sit next to her. She nodded. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was the silence of two who had already said everything and now only understood. For a few minutes, they simply stood there, listening to the crackling of the wood. Until Helena, with a firm voice, broke the silence. She said that for a long time, she believed her biggest mistake had been betraying him, destroying what they had. But as time passed, she understood that the mistake began much earlier, when she stopped listening, when she stopped seeing him as a companion and began to see him as part of the routine. Lucas listened attentively, without interrupting. And then she continued. She said she was aware that he was ready to love, to build, to face any obstacle, even those that seemed insurmountable. And that she, immature and insecure, had run away. She was a coward. And the greatest punishment wasn't losing him, it was realizing, later, that she would never be loved that way by anyone else. Lucas lowered his head, took a deep breath, and responded gently. He said he listened to her with respect, and that the pain, which had once pierced him like a knife, was now just a scar. That he'd learned to look back without anger, because he understood that not everything that breaks needs to be fixed. Some things break to show they weren't ready to bear the weight of the truth. And that he no longer blamed her. Because today he was happy in a way he never imagined he would be. And this happiness didn't erase their story, it just put it in perspective. Helena nodded, her eyes watering, but without tears. It was what she needed to hear, even though it hurt. It was real closure. No illusion, no going back. Just truth. After that conversation, Helena didn't see Lucas often again. They exchanged a few polite messages in the following months, mainly on important dates. But contact became increasingly sparse. And she didn't force it. She knew that some connections need to be loosened for life to move on. What remained was a feeling of deep respect. For him. And for herself. Because, contrary to what she feared, she didn't end up an eternal victim of her own decisions. She ended up as someone who had the courage to face her flaws, to own her guilt, to rebuild her own story with dignity. She didn't erase the past, but wrote a new present over it, with firmer, more conscious letters. Over time, Helena truly smiled again. Not the same smile as before, but a new, more complete one. She began attending writing groups, published a small book of chronicles about loss and new beginnings, and began to be invited to lectures on ethics and emotional reconstruction. She didn't talk about her story openly, but those who paid attention to the details realized that each word carried lived truths. One day, a student asked her if she believed that true love only happens once. And Helena, with a serene smile, replied that she didn't. That true love can happen more than once, but that recognizing a true love and destroying it is a choice that forever changes the way we experience those close to us. That it is possible to love again, yes, but never in the same way. Because the first love we betray isn't the other, it's the part of us that believed it would be different. Helena and Lucas's story didn't end with reconciliation, it didn't become a fairy tale, but it did transform into something much rarer: maturity. Learning. A lesson. A hard but necessary lesson. That sometimes, those we love deeply leave, and that this goodbye is what allows each of us to become who we need to be. And when we accept this, pain gives way to peace. Not overnight, but at the precise pace of awareness. And so it was, amid silent goodbyes and discreet new beginnings, that life demonstrated what it has always tried to teach: true love only survives where there is truth. And once broken, it isn't mended with promises or regrets, it is mended with actions. But when lost, sometimes the only possible course of action is to let go. Because love is also knowing when to stop trying. Time, as always, followed its course, relentless, silent, immune to human regrets. What had been said, lived, lost, and transformed was now crystallized in the memory of two people who had once been everything to each other, and who were now merely memories crossed on different roads. Months turned into years, and each of them followed such different paths that it would be impossible to imagine them together again. What remained was what no one could take away: the experience, the learning, and, above all, the awareness of the price paid for each choice made. Lucas gradually built a new chapter in his life, not as someone who replaced someone, but as someone who began anew with more truth. The woman who stood by his side today didn't know the deepest layers of his past, but she respected the depth of his pauses, understood his silences, and stood by him firmly on the good days and on the days when the past still scratched at his chest. It wasn't a relationship made for show, but for living deeply. Together, they adopted a 3-year-old girl, who arrived like a sweet hurricane in their lives, disrupting their routine and filling the spaces that had previously been untouchable. Lucas, seeing her run around the house, calling him Dad naturally, felt something no previous experience had been able to evoke: belonging. It wasn't about blood, it was about bond. And this bond, unlike anything he'd ever known, brought no pain or doubt. It brought only peace. He smiled with his eyes again, and that said more than any social media could. You didn't need to prove anything. The new family he had formed didn't carry the ghosts of the past, but the lightness of someone who knows the value of the present. On a random afternoon, sitting by the sea with his daughter sleeping in his lap and his wife at his side, Lucas thought about everything he had experienced. Not with sadness, but with a serenity that only deep understanding allows. He understood, finally, that love is not eternal in itself. It is eternal when it is cared for, when it is protected from boredom, from ego, from the temptation to think everything is replaceable. And that, when one chooses to hurt a sincere love, what is lost is not just the other person, it is a part of oneself that will never be recovered. Helena, on the other hand, had also changed. But her journey was longer, more solitary, and, therefore, more transformative. She never again tried to rebuild what she had with Lucas, because she understood that that love could not be replicated. She tried, yes, to live other stories, but she no longer sought salvation in anyone's eyes. She had learned that relying on another to fill one's own emptiness is the shortest path to repeating the same mistakes. Therefore, she cultivated some time for herself. She invested in her own emotional autonomy, rediscovering the woman who existed before, but now with enough maturity not to lose herself again. She published her second book, now more profound, more truthful. People began to seek her out not as a writer, but as someone who deeply understood what it meant to make mistakes, to fall, and still move forward without pretense. In a recent lecture, when asked what she'd learned most throughout her life, she replied without hesitation, that some choices have an echo. And that love, when betrayed, doesn't die instantly. It rots slowly, from within, until nothing remains but silence. The room fell silent for long seconds. And in that moment, even those who had never been betrayed or betrayed anyone understood what she meant. Because there was a real woman there, scarred, but standing tall. Not perfect, not redeemed from everything, but aware. And awareness, in some cases, is the only possible form of peace. She and Lucas never met again. There was no need. There was no hurt, but there was also no more space. The stories had run their course, and time had firmly healed the stitches that needed to be stitched together. Each had their own outcome. Each followed what they sowed, and reaped exactly what they sowed. And if life were a courtroom, it would be easy to declare justice served. But life is more complex than that. It doesn't punish with violence, it punishes with lucidity. With the clarity that what is lost with betrayal is not just a relationship, but the right to be seen again with the same eyes. Because love may forgive, but it will never be naive again. It will never be the same again. And now, as we reach the end of this story, it's impossible not to wonder, how many true loves were buried in the name of empty passion? How many families were torn apart by momentary need? How many promises were forgotten behind closed doors, without the one who swore realizing what they were destroying? The truth is that betrayal doesn't just hurt the other person, it corrodes the very identity of the betrayer. Because no one emerges unscathed from a decision that breaks a bond of trust, commitment, and reciprocity. The damage isn't just romantic. It's moral. It's existential. And that's why stories like this need to be told. Not to judge, not to condemn, but to remind, with force, that loyalty is still a non-negotiable value. That true love, when found, must be cherished with both hands. Because rebuilding is possible, yes. But it will never be the same. And sometimes what you lose, is the most precious thing you could ever have in life. If you've made it this far, with your heart stirred and your mind silent, share with us, what did this story make you feel? Comment below, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you believe these stories offer important insights, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share with someone who needs to hear this today. And never forget, this channel does not, under any circumstances, support any kind of infidelity. Our purpose is clear, to show, through fiction, how infidelity destroys not only relationships, but the most noble essence of human beings, the capacity to love and be loyal. Until the next story. And remember, those who cheat may regret it, but the love that was betrayed, will never be the same again.